A mountain man lived alone for years, until 5 bleeding widows knocked on his door in the middle of a blizzard. He thought he'd buried his heart with his wife and son. But that night, fate came knocking through the storm. 5 women, half frozen and covered in blood, begging for shelter, while one clutched a dying child. He could have turned them away. But something in their eyes, a kind of faith he'd forgotten, made him open that door. As he fights to save their lives, he discovers a secret buried in his own past, a forged deed, a stolen colony, and a railroad man willing to burn everything to the ground to keep it quiet. Now the man who swore off the world must protect the only souls who ever believed in him. When the snow melts and the smoke clears, will he find forgiveness or lose the only family he has left? And in a land ruled by greed and guns, what happens when mercy becomes the bravest act of all? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind howled through the pines, rattling the worn shingles of Gale Thorne's cabin. He sat alone at his rough-hewn table, watching the lamplight dance across the tin plate of cold beans before him. His large frame cast a lonely shadow on the log walls, a shadow that had grown too familiar over the years since Sarah and little Thomas had been taken by the fever. "At least the roof's mostly fixed now," he muttered to the empty room, a habit born of too many solitary years. The day's work had left his hands raw from wrestling with weather-warped boards, but the patch job would have to do before the next storm rolled in. Beyond his window, dark clouds gathered over the Colorado peaks, promising more snow to add to the drifts already piled against his cabin walls. The spoon scraped against tin as he finished his meager supper. Sarah would have scolded him for eating cold, but heating the beans seemed more trouble than it was worth for just himself. The familiar ache in his chest tightened as he remembered her voice, always gentle even in correction. A wolf's howl echoed across the valley, drawing his attention to the window. The sound was distant enough, but something else carried on the wind, something that made him set down his spoon and tilt his head to listen more carefully. There it came again. A human cry, weak but distinct. Guile rose from his chair, his joints protesting the sudden movement after hours of roof work in the cold. He grabbed his heavy coat from its peg and pulled it on, then lifted his rifle from above the door more from habit than any real thought of needing it. The lamp cast yellow light across the packed snow as he opened the door, holding it steady against the wind's attempt to snatch it from his grip. "Hello?" he called out, his voice rough from disuse. "Someone out there?" The wind's response was another cry, closer now, and the sound of stumbling feet. Through the swirling snow, dark figures emerged, several of them, moving slowly and unsteadily. As they drew nearer, the lamplight revealed 5 women, their skirts caked with snow and something darker. One stumbled and nearly fell, clutching a bundle to her chest. "Lord have mercy," Gale breathed, the words coming unbidden from somewhere deep in his Methodist upbringing. The bundle in the woman's arms moved weakly, a child, he realized, and from the dark stains on the wrappings, one badly hurt. His first instinct was to shut the door, to return to his solitude, rather than invite whatever tragedy these strangers carried into his carefully ordered world. But Sarah's voice whispered in his memory. "The Lord sends us trials to test our hearts, Gale. Will you turn away from his children in need?" With a grunt that was half resignation and half prayer, Gale stepped out into the snow. "Come on," he said, moving to support the woman with the child. "Get inside, all of you, before you freeze solid." The women stumbled past him into the cabin's warmth, tracking snow and blood across his floor. He counted them as they entered. 5 women, all looking half dead from cold and exhaustion, and the child. The woman carrying the boy, he could see now it was a boy of perhaps 8 years, swayed on her feet. "Here," Gale said, guiding her to his own bed in the corner. "Lay him down easy." He turned to the others, who huddled near his fireplace where only embers glowed. "Rest yourselves. I'll build up the fire." His hands moved automatically, adding kindling and logs to the coals, his mind racing to adjust to this invasion of his sanctuary. As flames began to catch and spread warmth through the cabin, he studied his unexpected guests more carefully. Their clothes, though trail-stained and torn, spoke of means. These weren't vagrants or wandering beggars. Their faces showed fear and exhaustion, but also a certain bearing that suggested education and breeding. "The boy needs tending first," one of the women said, her voice cultured despite her obvious exhaustion. "We've done what we could, but—" Gale nodded, already moving to the trunk where he kept his medical supplies. The skills he'd learned as a Union Army medic had grown rusty with disuse, but some things a man never forgot. "Tell me what happened while I look at him," he said, gathering bandages and the few medicines he had on hand. The women exchanged glances, fear and uncertainty plain on their faces. Finally, the one who had spoken before, a tall woman with graying hair, stepped forward. "We were part of a wagon train heading to Denver. Raiders attacked 3 days ago. Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "They killed the men. All of them. We managed to escape in the confusion, but little Jonah took a bullet." Gale's hands stilled for a moment as he absorbed this. Raiders, likely the same band that had been terrorizing settlers across the territory. He'd heard rumors of their brutality but had kept to his mountain, telling himself it wasn't his concern. Now their violence had literally landed on his doorstep. The boy, Jonah, whimpered as Gale carefully unwrapped the blood-stained bandages. The wound was ugly, a through and through in the shoulder that had bled far too much for such a small body. Infection had already set in, angry red streaks spreading from the entry wound. "How'd you find your way here?" he asked, partly to distract himself from the gravity of the boy's condition, partly to keep the child's mind off what he was about to do. "We saw smoke from your chimney," another of the women answered, younger than the first, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "We've been walking since it happened, following the creek up the mountain. We didn't know if anyone would be here, but we had to try, for Jonah's sake." Gale nodded, his hands moving with remembered skill as he cleaned the wound. The boy was brave, biting back cries as the former medic worked, though tears streaked his dirt-stained face. "You're a tough one, ain't you?" Gale murmured, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "Reminds me of my Thomas." He caught himself, pushing away the memory before it could take hold. This wasn't the time for old grief. The boy needed him now, needed the skills he'd learned in field hospitals and forgotten in years of solitude. As he worked, he was aware of the women watching him, their faces showing both hope and fear. They'd risked everything bringing the boy here, trusting a stranger might help where they couldn't. "He's young and strong," Gale said at last, securing the fresh bandage. "If we can break the fever and keep the infection from spreading, he's got a fair chance." He reached for his canteen, helping Jonah take small sips of water. "Rest now, boy. You're safe here." The child's eyes, glazed with fever, fixed on Gale's face. "Are you an angel?" he whispered, his small voice serious. A laugh, rusty from disuse, surprised its way out of Gale's chest. "No, boy. Just an old mountain man who knows a thing or two about patching people up." He smoothed the blanket over the child, remembering how Sarah used to tuck Thomas in at night. Sleep if you can. Things'll look brighter come morning." Rising from the bedside, Gale turned to the women. They needed care, too. All showed signs of exposure and exhaustion, though none appeared seriously injured. "There's stew in the pot," he said, moving to stir the coals beneath it. "Not much, but it's hot. Best eat while you can." As he ladled out portions into tin cups, all he had besides his own plate, Goyle's mind worked on the problem before him. His cabin was small, meant for one man alone, not 5 women and a sick child. His supplies, carefully rationed for winter, would run short quickly with so many mouths to feed. The nearest settlement was 2 days' hard ride in good weather, and with another storm coming. But looking at these women, watching them warm their hands around cups of thin stew, seeing the trust in their eyes as they watched over the sleeping child, Goyle knew he couldn't turn them away. Whatever his own preference for solitude, whatever the cost to his carefully maintained isolation, he was responsible for them now. "You can stay," he said abruptly, cutting through the tired silence. "Till the boy's stronger, at least. Storm's coming anyway. Wouldn't be Christian to send you out in it." The gray-haired woman who'd spoken earlier set down her cup. "We're grateful, Mr. Thorne," he supplied. "Gale Thorne." "Mr. Thorne," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "I'm Mrs. Harrison. These are Mrs. Chen, Mrs. O'Brien, Mrs. Whitaker, and Mrs. Reynolds." Each woman nodded as she was introduced. "And the boy is Jonah Miller. His mother—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Gale nodded, accepting the introductions without comment. He moved to check his supplies, mentally calculating how to make them stretch. "There's space by the fire," he said over his shoulder. "Not much, but it's warm. I've got some blankets stored away. We'll make do." As he dug through his trunk for the extra blankets, Gale caught his reflection in the small mirror Sarah had insisted on bringing when they'd first come to the mountain. His face, weathered by years and grief, looked foreign to him, less hard somehow, despite the silver in his beard and the lines around his eyes. Something had changed in the space of an hour, something he couldn't name but could feel as surely as he felt the storm coming. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the newly mended roof. But inside, the fire crackled warmly, and the soft breathing of his unexpected guests filled the cabin with sounds he'd almost forgotten. The sounds of other lives, of human presence, of responsibility accepted and sanctuary given. Goyle distributed the blankets, then settled into his chair by the fire. The boy would need checking through the night, and he didn't trust himself to sleep anyway. As he watched the flames dance, Sarah's voice came to him again, gentle as always. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, love. Sometimes he sends us what we need, not what we think we want." The cabin creaked in the rising wind, but for the first time in years, it felt less like a hermit's refuge, and more like something else, something he'd lost and forgotten how to name. Home, maybe. Or at least the beginning of one. Through the long winter night, Guile worked without rest, his movements precise despite his exhaustion. The familiar rhythm of battlefield medicine came back to him as naturally as breathing. He kept the fire blazing high, feeding it precious wood from his carefully stacked pile. The flames cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls as he tended to the boy's wounds. "Need more hot water," he muttered, lifting the heavy iron kettle. His hands, roughened by years of trapping, moved with surprising gentleness as he tore strips of his cleanest shirts for bandages. The cloth had to be boiled to prevent fever. He'd learned that lesson the hard way in the war, watching too many good men die from infected wounds. The child thrashed in his fever dreams, crying out for his mother. Each time, the sound pierced Gale's carefully constructed walls of isolation. It was too familiar, too close to memories he'd tried to bury. He pushed the thoughts away, focusing instead on the task at hand. "Hush now, boy," he murmured, wiping the child's forehead with a cool cloth. "You're safe here." The gray-haired woman who'd introduced herself earlier moved closer, her quilted shawl wrapped tight against the chill. "I'm Clara," she said softly. "Clara Whitcomb. Let me help. I've some experience with sickbeds." Gale nodded, grateful for the assistance. Clara proved steady-handed and calm, following his instructions without question as they cleaned and redressed the wound. The bullet had gone clean through, which was a blessing, but the blood loss and exposure to cold had weakened the boy considerably. As they worked, the other women began speaking quietly, sharing their stories in hushed voices that barely carried over the crackling fire and howling wind. "I'm Abigail Holt," said the younger woman who'd first spoken of following the smoke to his cabin. Her voice carried the cultured tones of formal education, though weariness roughened its edges. "I was a schoolteacher in Kansas before." She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Before my husband was killed defending Apache workers at the railroad camp." One of the other women, wrapped in a blanket decorated with intricate beadwork, lifted her head. "I am Nantan," she said softly. Her English was clear, but carried the musical cadence of her native Apache. "My husband also worked railroad. He died in mine collapse 3 moons ago." "Mei Li," offered another woman quietly, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. She spoke carefully, as if weighing each word. "My husband. He lay tracks for Central Pacific. Fever took him last spring." The last woman, who had been humming softly to herself while grinding something between 2 smooth stones, looked up. "Ruth Littlebird," she said simply. "Navajo midwife. My man was killed by soldiers who couldn't tell peaceful farmers from raiders." There was old pain in her voice, but no bitterness, just a deep weariness. Guile absorbed their stories as he worked, each tale of loss echoing his own hidden grief. He said nothing, but his hands were gentle as he tended to their various cuts and bruises, evidence of their desperate flight through the wilderness. The night crept forward with agonizing slowness. Gale taught Clara how to check the boy's breathing and pulse, showing her the signs to watch for. Together they spooned thin broth between the child's cracked lips, coaxing him to swallow. Ruth contributed herbs from a small medicine pouch she'd managed to keep during their flight, brewing a tea that seemed to ease the boy's breathing. "My Thomas was about his age," Gale found himself saying in the darkest hours before dawn, his voice rough with exhaustion. He hadn't spoken his son's name aloud in years, when the fever took him and Sarah both. Abigail's hand touched his shoulder briefly, a gesture of understanding that required no words. In that moment, Gale realized these women knew the shape of his solitude, recognized it as kin to their own losses. The boy's fever finally broke as the first gray light of dawn began seeping through the cabin's single window. Guile had just finished stitching the last of the wound, neat, careful sutures that would leave minimal scarring. His hands trembled slightly from fatigue as he tied off the final knot. "Reckon he'll make it now," he said, more to himself than the women. "Strong little fellow." Leaving Clara to watch over the sleeping child, Gale pushed himself to his feet. His bones protested the long night spent crouching beside the makeshift sickbed. He made his way to the cabin door, needing to see the morning light to assure himself that they'd all survived the night. The door creaked as he pulled it open, letting in a rush of cold mountain air that carried the clean scent of pine and snow. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by white. The sunrise painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold, a sight that would have moved him in younger days, before grief had dulled his appreciation for beauty. "Thank you," came Abigail's voice from behind him. She'd followed him to the doorway, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. When he turned to look at her, her eyes met his steadily, filled with something that took him a moment to recognize. Faith. Not just gratitude for his help, but a deeper certainty that their arrival at his cabin had been no accident. "Just did what needed doing," he mumbled, uncomfortable with her steady gaze. "Nevertheless," she said quietly, "God guided our steps to your door. I believe that with all my heart." Gale had no answer for such faith. He'd left his own beliefs buried in a small grave alongside his wife and son. And yet, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold, hearing the soft breathing of the sleeping child and the quiet movements of the women making themselves useful in his cabin, something shifted inside him. Like spring ice breaking up on the river, a crack appeared in the frozen shell of his isolation. He found himself remembering Sarah's favorite Bible verse, words he hadn't allowed himself to think of in years. "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." The boy's voice, weak but clear, broke through his thoughts. "Mrs. Holt, Mr. Thorne." Gale turned from the doorway, moving back to the bedside with Abigail close behind. The child's eyes were clear now, free of fever's glaze. He looked small and fragile, among the blankets, but his gaze was alert as it moved between them. "How you feeling, boy?" Gale asked gruffly, checking the bandages with careful hands. "Hungry?" came the quiet reply, bringing a chorus of relieved laughter from the women. Clara was already moving to the hearth, where she'd kept broth warming through the night. "That we can fix," she said, her practical tone barely hiding her emotion. Gale stepped back, letting the women fuss over the child. He was bone-weary, his hands shaking slightly from the long night's work. But watching Abigail smooth the boy's hair back from his forehead, seeing Clara's efficient movements as she prepared food, hearing Ruth's soft humming and May's quiet questions about the child's comfort, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't happiness. He wasn't sure he remembered what that felt like. But it was something close to purpose, a feeling that perhaps his continued existence served some use beyond mere survival. He'd kept his medical supplies all these years out of habit, telling himself they were for his own needs. Now he wondered if they'd been waiting for this moment. These people. The morning light filled his cabin, transforming the familiar space. What had been a shelter for one man's grief was becoming something else. A sanctuary for these broken pieces of humanity that had blown into his life like leaves before a storm. He wasn't sure how he felt about that yet, but watching the boy take his first proper spoonfuls of broth, he knew he couldn't turn them away. Not yet, anyway. Not while the boy needed care. Not while winter held the mountains in its grip. After that, well, he'd think about after when it came. For now, he had patience to tend to, and that was enough. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the snow-laden branches outside Gale's cabin. Inside, the wounded boy slept peacefully, his breathing steady and strong. The worst of the crisis had passed, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Yet there was work to be done. Gale stood at his window, watching as the temperature rose enough to soften the snow's crusty surface. He knew they'd need more firewood soon. Feeding 6 people and keeping a sick child warm would quickly deplete his carefully stacked supply. "Reckon it's time to build a proper sled," he muttered to himself, already mentally cataloging the materials he'd need. His old one had broken last winter, and he'd never got around to replacing it. Behind him, the cabin had taken on an unfamiliar rhythm of life. The women moved with quiet efficiency, their initial shock giving way to practical necessity. Clara swept the rough wooden floor with a makeshift broom of bound pine branches. May organized his scattered medical supplies into neat rows, while Ruth tended to the fire with the expertise of one who'd kept many hearths. Nantan sat cross-legged by the boy's bedside, singing softly in Apache. A healing song, though Gale didn't know the words. The melody stirred something in his memory, a half-forgotten tune his mother used to hum while working in her garden. Abigail had taken charge of his meager kitchen supplies, somehow managing to create order from chaos. She'd found his cache of dried beans and salt pork, and the cabin now filled with the promising smell of actual cooking rather than his usual cold meals. "Mr. Thorne," she called softly, careful not to wake the sleeping child. "There's coffee, if you'd like some before you head out." He turned from the window, surprised to find a tin cup of steaming coffee waiting on his rough-hewn table. He couldn't remember the last time someone had poured him coffee. "Much obliged," he managed, wrapping his calloused hands around the warm metal. The coffee was different, better than his usual bitter brew. She'd done something to take the edge off, perhaps using some of the dried chicory root he'd forgotten he had. Outside, he found 2 sturdy pine poles that would serve as runners for the sled. Working in the crisp morning air, Guile shaped and smoothed them with his draw knife, the familiar motion soothing his troubled thoughts. He'd always found peace in working with his hands. The women's voices drifted out to him as they set the cabin to rights. He heard May laugh at something Clara said, the sound bright and unexpected in the mountain silence. It had been years since laughter echoed off these walls. By midday, the sled was taking shape. He'd fashioned cross braces and a flat bed from split logs, lashing everything together with rawhide he'd been saving for moccasin repairs. The work was good, solid. It would serve for hauling wood and whatever else they might need. The cabin door creaked open, and Abigail stepped out carrying another cup of coffee and a plate with what looked like fresh cornbread. The smell made his stomach growl, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday. "You should eat something," she said, setting both on a nearby stump. "We found some cornmeal in your stores. Hope you don't mind. We're trying to make things stretch." Guile straightened from his work, his back protesting the movement. "Don't mind at all. Been a while since I had proper cornbread." She watched him test the sled's runners, her eyes taking in his careful craftsmanship. "You're good with your hands, like my Thomas was." The mention of her dead husband hung in the air between them. Gale nodded, unsure how to respond to the pain in her voice. "We should talk," she said finally. "About where we're headed, once the boy's strong enough to travel." Gale broke off a piece of cornbread, buying time before answering. It was still warm, perfectly baked. Nothing like his usual heavy, half-raw attempts. "There's a place," she continued, wrapping her shawl tighter against the mountain chill. "A colony, just over the pass. Reverend Matthews promised us land there, a fresh start for widows and their children. Other women are waiting for us." Something cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled in Gale's stomach. "Widows' colony?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Abigail nodded. "The Reverend secured the land grant last spring, said it was God's provision for those left behind." Her eyes grew distant. "After Thomas was killed, I didn't know where to turn. Then I heard about the colony, a place where we could work our own land, support each other. No more depending on the charity of others." Guile's hands had gone still on the sled runner. Memories he'd tried to drown in whiskey years ago came flooding back. A smooth-talking man named Rafferty, papers pushed across a saloon table, the scratch of his signature in exchange for a bottle of decent bourbon. "When was this grant issued?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Last April, according to the letter I received. Abigail pulled a worn envelope from her pocket. Reverend Matthews said everything was properly filed with the territorial office. Gale turned back to his work, unable to meet her eyes. The guilt rose like bile in his throat. Had those papers he'd signed while drunk been part of this? He couldn't remember the details, just Rafferty's satisfied smile as he'd pocketed the documents. "The boy's welcome to stay till he's healed," he said gruffly. "All of you are. But after that..." He left the sentence unfinished, testing the sled's binding with more force than necessary. Abigail was quiet for a long moment. "We're grateful for your help, Mr. Thorne. More than we can say. But these women, they need hope. Something to believe in. The colony gives them that." The weight of her words settled heavy on his shoulders. He'd carried enough guilt these past years without adding more. Yet watching these women work to restore dignity to their lives, hearing the quiet determination in Abigail's voice, it stirred something he'd thought long dead. The day wore on, and Gale made 3 trips with his new sled, hauling enough firewood to keep the cabin warm through the coming nights. Each time he returned, the place felt different, cleaner, more ordered, as if the women's presence was slowly transforming his hermitage into something like a home. As dusk approached, Abigail gathered everyone for the evening meal. She'd somehow stretched his meager supplies into a proper supper: beans flavored with wild onions, cornbread, and tea made from pine needles rich in healing properties. The boy was awake now, propped up on Gale's only pillow. Color had returned to his cheeks, and he managed a few spoonfuls of food before drifting back to sleep. When the dishes were cleared away, Abigail called the women to prayer. They formed a circle near the hearth, joining hands. Gale moved to step outside, as he always did at prayer time, but Abigail's voice stopped him. "Join us, Mr. Thorne?" He shook his head, unable to find words to explain his resistance. Prayer belonged to a different life, one buried with Sarah and Thomas. Yet he didn't walk away entirely, choosing instead to lean against the cabin wall, close enough to hear but separate. The women's voices rose in an old hymn he remembered from his childhood, "Amazing Grace." Nantan and May, though unfamiliar with the words, hummed along with the melody. Ruth's clear alto carried the harmony, while Clara's soprano soared above them all. Abigail's voice was steady and true, leading them through each verse. The familiar words wrapped around him like his mother's quilt, bringing memories he'd thought safely buried. Sarah singing as she worked, Thomas learning the tune at her knee, his own voice once raised in praise. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. The guilt still churned in his gut. Guilt over those papers, over surviving when his family hadn't, over all the ways he'd failed to be the man Sarah believed him to be. But for now, in this moment, the hymn filled his cabin with something he'd forgotten existed. Grace, perhaps, or at least its echo. He didn't join the circle, couldn't bring himself to take those steps. But he stayed, and he listened, and somewhere deep inside, a door he'd thought forever sealed creaked open just a fraction. The last notes faded into the gathering darkness. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and steady, while inside, the fire crackled, and 6 women and a healing boy made themselves at home in his solitude. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight, this was enough. The days settled into an uneasy rhythm at Gale's cabin. The boy grew stronger, color returning to his cheeks as Abigail tended his wounds with careful hands. The other women kept busy, turning the bachelor's hovel into something closer to home with each passing hour. Gile spent most of his time outside, the steady thunk of his axe echoing through the trees. The woodpile grew taller than necessary, but the work kept him from dwelling too long on the changes happening inside his cabin. The physical labor was simpler than watching Abigail move through his space, her quiet efficiency stirring memories he'd rather leave buried. On this particular morning, the winter sun hung pale in a cloudless sky. Giles' breath fogged in the crisp air as he squared up another log. Inside, he could hear the women's voices mixing with the clatter of breakfast dishes being washed. "We're running low on candles," he heard Abigail say through the partially open door. "Mr. Thorne must keep extras stored somewhere." Gale paused mid-swing, remembering the trunk beneath his bed where he kept such supplies. He meant to call out, to tell her he'd fetch them himself, but the axe was already committed to its arc. The blade bit deep into the wood with a satisfying crack. Inside the cabin, Abigail knelt beside Gale's bed, pulling out the heavy trunk. The worn leather was smooth under her fingers as she worked the simple latch. The trunk's hinges creaked as she lifted the lid. Inside, she found the expected collection of a mountain man's possessions, spare clothes carefully folded, ammunition wrapped in oiled cloth, a few treasured books. But it was the packet of papers wedged against one side that caught her attention. Something about their official appearance made her pause. She shouldn't pry. The man had taken them in, saved the boy's life. Yet her fingers moved of their own accord, drawing out the folded documents. The territorial seal was immediately visible, the papers crisp despite their age. Her eyes scanned the formal text, then stopped. Read again. The blood drained from her face as the words became clear. A land deed, dated 3 years prior, granting ownership of a particular parcel of land, the very land promised to the widow's colony. And there at the bottom, unmistakable, Gale Thorne's signature. The thunk of the axe continued outside, steady as a heartbeat. Abigail's hands trembled as she read through the document again, hoping she'd somehow misunderstood. But the words remained unchanged. The land they'd been promised, the hope that had sustained them through loss and hardship, already belonged to someone else. To the very man who'd taken them in. She stood slowly, the papers clutched in her hand. The other women looked up from their tasks, noting her pale face. "Abigail?" Clara asked, concern in her voice. "What's wrong?" The cabin door opened then, Guile ducking his tall frame through with an armload of split wood. He froze at the sight of Abigail holding the papers, understanding dawning in his eyes. "When were you going to tell us?" Abigail's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the sudden silence like a knife. "That the land we're heading for, our colony, belongs to you?" Gale set the wood down carefully, buying time. The other women had gone still, watching the scene unfold. "It's not what you think," he said finally, his voice rough. "Not what I think." Abigail held up the papers, her hand shaking. "Your signature is right here, Mr. Thorne, on a deed dated 3 years ago for the exact parcel of land Reverend Matthews promised us." May and Nantan exchanged worried glances. Ruth pulled the boy closer, as if to shield him from the tension filling the cabin. "I didn't know," Gale said, spreading his hands, "about the colony, about any of it. Those papers, I was drunk. A man named Rafferty." "Drunk?" Abigail's laugh held no humor. "You signed away land promised to widows and orphans because you were drunk?" The accusation hung in the air between them. Gale's shoulders slumped, the weight of his past sins finally catching up. "The signature's real enough," he admitted. "But the deed, Rafferty was a con man. Had me sign papers while I was deep in the bottle. Didn't even know what they were for." "And that makes it better?" Abigail's voice rose. "Our husbands are dead, Mr. Thorne. We have nothing left but the promise of this land, a chance to build something new, And now we find out it was all a lie? The other women had drawn together, their faces showing various stages of betrayal and dismay. Even the boy was awake now, watching with wide eyes. "I'll make it right," Gale said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Whatever Rafferty did with my signature." "How?" Abigail demanded. "How can you make this right? There are more women coming, Mr. Thorne. Widows like us, with children to feed, all of them believing in Reverend Matthews's promise." Gale had no answer. The guilt he'd carried these past years, buried under isolation and routine, rose up to choke him. "I think you should go," Abigail said quietly. The other women nodded, already gathering their few possessions. "You can't travel yet," Gale protested. "The boy's not strong enough, and there's another storm coming." "We've imposed on your hospitality long enough." Abigail's voice was ice. "Clearly, we were never meant to be here." The women moved with quick efficiency, packing what little they had. Guile stood helpless, watching as they prepared to leave. He wanted to explain about Rafferty, about the years of drinking that followed Sarah's death, about how he'd never meant to hurt anyone. But the words wouldn't come. Within an hour, the cabin had been stripped of all signs of their presence. The women bundled themselves against the cold, helping the boy wrap up warmly. They filed out without looking at Gale, their faces set with the determination of those used to starting over. Abigail was the last to leave. She placed the deed carefully on the table, smoothing it with fingers that still trembled slightly. "Thank you for saving Daniel's life," she said formally. "We won't trouble you again." The door closed behind her with a quiet click. Goyle stood alone in his cabin, now eerily silent after days of feminine voices and movement. Outside, he could hear the women organizing themselves for travel, their voices muted by distance and growing snow. As darkness fell, Gale found himself standing at his cabin window, watching the snow pile up in the growing gloom. The women had made camp just within sight, their small fire a defiant spark against the gathering storm. "Reckon this is it then," he muttered to the empty room. "God's finally calling in his markers." The snow continued to fall, erasing tracks and smoothing rough edges. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the ache in his chest. He'd grown used to solitude over the years, had convinced himself it was what he deserved after Sarah and Thomas died. But now, watching the women's fire flicker bravely against the darkness, that solitude felt less like choice and more like punishment. The deed lay where Abigail had left it, moonlight catching the territorial seal. Gale stared at his signature, remembering that night in the saloon. He'd been 3 days into a drinking binge, trying to forget the anniversary of his family's deaths. Rafferty had seemed friendly enough, buying rounds and listening to Gale's slurred stories. The papers had appeared late in the evening, presented as some simple business matter that needed a witness signature. "Just your name here, friend," Rafferty had said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Nothing to worry about." Gale had signed without reading, too drunk to care about anything beyond the promise of another bottle. He'd forgotten about it entirely until seeing his signature today on the deed Abigail found. Now those women huddled in the snow, their dreams of a fresh start shattered by his carelessness. The boy, Daniel, he'd heard Abigail call him, barely recovered from his wounds, all because he'd been too deep in his cups to question what he was signing. Sarah would be ashamed, he whispered to the darkness. His wife had been the believer, the one who saw God's hand in everything. She'd tried to keep his faith alive after Thomas died, but he'd pushed her away, retreated into drink and anger until the fever took her too. The wind picked up, driving snow against the window in white sheets. The women's fire wavered but held steady, a testament to their determination. Guile watched it until his eyes burned, knowing sleep wouldn't come tonight. The guilt sat heavy in his stomach, familiar as an old wound, but sharper now. He'd thought himself beyond redemption years ago, had made his peace with living and dying alone in these mountains. But seeing the trust die in Abigail's eyes, watching hope drain from the women's faces, it cut deeper than he'd expected. "Too late for sorry now," he told the empty cabin. The words fell flat in the silence, no different from all the other nights he'd talked to ghosts. Outside, the storm gathered strength, and somewhere in the darkness, 5 women and a healing boy faced the cold without the shelter they'd been promised. Gale stood at his window, keeping vigil as snow erased the world, muttering prayers he no longer believed would be heard. The gray dawn crept over the mountains like spilled milk, casting weak shadows across Gale's cabin yard. He tightened Bearclaw's saddle straps with practiced hands, checking each buckle twice. The big roan horse stamped impatiently, his breath making clouds in the cold morning air. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Abigail stepped out, wrapping a worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You're really going, then?" Guile nodded without turning. "Reckon I need to set things straight." He adjusted the rifle in its scabbard, making sure it rode easy. "Should be back by nightfall." "And if you're not?" Her voice carried both worry and lingering distrust. "Then you ladies best head out come morning." He finally faced her, his expression grave. "But I aim to return with proof those papers ain't worth the ink they're printed with." The other women watched from the doorway, Ruth holding young Daniel, May, and Nantan standing close together, Clara hanging back in the shadows. Their faces showed a mix of hope and doubt that made Goyle's chest tighten. "Firewood stacked by the door," he said, mounting up. "Plenty of beans in the pantry. Storm's blown itself out, so you should be warm enough." Abigail stepped closer to Bearclaw, her hand resting on the horse's shoulder. "Be careful, Mr. Thorne. Railroad men aren't known for their understanding nature." Gale touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then nudged Bearclaw forward. The horse's hooves crunched through the fresh snow as they headed down the trail toward Redemption Gulch. He could feel the women's eyes on his back until the trees swallowed him from view. The trail wound down through stands of pine and aspen, following the curve of the mountain. Bearclaw picked his way carefully over icy patches, steam rising from his flanks despite the cold. Gale kept one hand loose on the reins, his mind churning over what he'd say when he found Rafferty. The memory of that night in the saloon 3 years ago grew clearer with each mile. Rafferty's smooth talk, the endless whiskey, the stack of papers that needed just a quick signature. Shame burned in Gale's gut, hot as rot gut. He'd been so deep in his grief back then, he would have signed anything just to keep the bottles coming. Around midday, Redemption Gulch came into view below. A scatter of wooden buildings hunched against the mountainside like drowsy cattle. Smoke rose straight up from chimneys in the still air, and the telegraph wire hummed faintly overhead. Not much had changed since Gale's last visit, though the railroad office looked newer, its fresh paint standing out against the weathered buildings around it. He rode past the general store, ignoring the curious stares from the few people on the street. The town had never welcomed him even before Sarah died, viewing him as too rough, too solitary. Now those same faces turned away quickly, shoulders stiffening as he passed. The saloon office sat at the far end of the street, a grand 2-story affair with gilt lettering on the windows. Denver Pacific Railroad Land Office, C. Rafferty, agent. Gale dismounted, tying Bearclaw to the hitching rail. His boots thudded heavily on the wooden steps. Inside, the familiar saloon smell of stale whiskey and tobacco smoke wrapped around him. A few early drinkers hunched over tables in the dim light, but Gale's attention fixed on the man behind the polished desk in the corner. Clive Rafferty hadn't changed much, still wore that city suit and watch chain, still had that smile that never reached his eyes. He looked up from his papers, recognition flickering across his face. "Well, if it isn't Gale Thorne," Rafferty said, standing. "It's been what, 3 years? Can I offer you a drink for old time's sake?" "No." Gale's voice was gravel rough. He planted both hands on Rafferty's desk, leaning forward. "We need to talk about some papers I signed." Rafferty's smile didn't waver. "Papers?" "My good man, we've handled dozens of land transactions. You'll have to be more specific." "The Widow's Colony, land, up near Broken Pine Creek." Gale pulled the deed from his coat, slapping it down on the desk. "This deed's got my signature, but I never agreed to take that land." "Ah, yes." Rafferty picked up the paper, examining it with exaggerated care. "Everything appears to be in order. Your signature, properly witnessed, all quite legal." "Legal?" Gale's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You got me drunk as a skunk and had me sign God knows what. That ain't legal where I come from." Rafferty's smile thinned. "Careful with such accusations, Mr. Thorne. A man's reputation is a delicate thing." He gestured at the chair across from his desk. "Why don't you sit down? We can discuss this like civilized men." Gale remained standing. "Nothing to discuss. That land was promised to widow women and their young ones. I want my signature off those papers." "I'm afraid that's impossible." Rafferty's voice hardened slightly. "The Denver Pacific has plans for that valley. Strategic plans, you understand. The railroad must expand." "Railroad?" Gale's eyes narrowed. "What's the railroad got to do with it?" Rafferty sighed, spreading his hands. "Progress, Mr. Thorne. The territory is growing. We need that land for a spur line, maintenance yards, worker housing. Surely you wouldn't stand in the way of progress." "Progress?" Heat rose in Gale's chest. "You're stealing land from widows and calling it progress?" Several of the saloon patrons looked up at his raised voice. Rafferty glanced around, then leaned forward, speaking low. "Keep your voice down, sir. I'd hate to have to call the sheriff." His smile turned cold. "Besides, your signature is perfectly legal. You sold the rights fair and square, or don't you remember?" The memory of that night surged back. Rafferty's smooth voice, the endless drinks, paper after paper pushed in front of him. How many had he signed? How much land had he given away without knowing? "I was drunk," Gale growled. "You knew damn well what you were doing." "Prove it." Rafferty sat back, adjusting his cuffs. "Your signature is witnessed, the sale recorded. The Denver Pacific now owns that land, through perfectly legal channels. Unless you'd care to challenge a major railroad company in court?" Shame and fury boiled in Gale's gut. His hands clenched into fists, and for a moment he imagined grabbing Rafferty by his fancy collar and showing him some mountain justice. But violence wouldn't help the widows, wouldn't give them back their promised land. "This ain't over," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "Oh, I think it is." Rafferty's smile was triumphant now. "Good day, Mr. Thorne. Do give my regards to those charming ladies camping on railroad property." Gale turned and strode out, his boots thundering on the wooden floor. The cold air hit him like a slap, clearing some of the rage from his head. He untied Bearclaw with shaking hands, swung into the saddle, and pointed the horse toward home. The ride back up the mountain gave him time to think, to let the full weight of what he'd learned settle on his shoulders. It wasn't just his drunken signature on a deed anymore. This was bigger, a railroad land grab using forged documents and false promises. How many other people had Rafferty tricked? How much land had the Denver Pacific stolen this way? The sun was dropping toward the western peaks when he finally caught sight of smoke from his cabin chimney. He'd been gone most of the day, and his body ached from the cold ride. But it was the weight in his chest that dragged at him most, the knowledge that his weakness had helped destroy these women's dreams. Abigail must have been watching for him. She stepped out onto the porch as he rode up, the other women gathering behind her. Their faces were hopeful, expectant. Gale dismounted slowly, feeling every one of his years. "Well?" Abigail asked. "Did you find him?" Gale nodded, leading Bearclaw toward the stable. "Found him right enough. Running the railroad office now, proud as you please." "And the papers?" He turned to face them, knowing they deserved the truth. "He claims everything's legal. Says the railroad owns that land now, meant for some new spur line." The words tasted like ashes in his mouth. "I'm sorry. I truly am." The hope drained from their faces. Ruth pulled Daniel closer, while May and Nantan exchanged worried glances. Clara sank down onto the porch steps, her shoulders slumping. But Abigail's expression hardened. "Legal, is it? We'll see about that." She stepped closer to Gale. "Tell me everything he said, every detail." Gale began unsaddling Bearclaw, relating his conversation with Rafferty as he worked. When he finished, the stable was quiet except for the horses' soft breathing and the whisper of hay under hooves. "So he admitted it," Abigail said finally. "Admitted using your signature to grab land for the railroad." "Admitted it proud as punch," Gale confirmed. "Not that it helps much. Man's got power behind him now. Railroad money, fancy lawyers." "Maybe." Abigail's voice held a note of determination that made him look up. "But he doesn't have the truth on his side. And sometimes that's enough." The winter sun had already dipped behind the mountains when Gale guided Bearclaw into the stable. His bones ached from the long ride, but the weight in his chest was heavier than any physical exhaustion. Through the cabin windows, lamplight glowed warm and welcoming, so different from the lonely darkness he'd known these past years. He took his time brushing down the horse, trying to sort through the tangle of shame and regret that knotted his thoughts. The familiar motions of curry comb against hide steadied him some, but couldn't quiet the echo of Rafferty's smug voice or ease the burden of what his weakness had cost these women. The stable door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold air and Abigail's slight figure. She carried a steaming cup, offering it without comment. The rich scent of coffee rose between them. "Much obliged," Gale muttered, accepting the cup. Its warmth seeped into his stiff fingers. "Stew's ready whenever you are," she said quietly. "The others are waiting." He nodded but didn't move. "Might be best if I eat out here." "Why's that?" "You know why." He took a long swallow of coffee, letting it burn away the taste of failure. "What happened today? What I done? Ain't exactly made me fit company?" Abigail studied him in the lantern light, her face gentle but firm. "That's not for you to decide. Come inside, Mr. Thorne. Share our meal." Something in her voice, not pity, but a steady kind of grace, made argument impossible. Gale followed her across the snowy yard to the cabin door. Inside, the other women had already gathered around the table. Clara stirred a pot of fragrant stew while May sliced bread. Ruth helped young Daniel into his chair, and Nantan laid out the tin plates with careful precision. They looked up as Gale entered, their faces showing neither accusation nor contempt. "Sit," Abigail said simply, gesturing to an empty chair. Gale hesitated, then sank onto the wooden seat. Steam rose from the bowls as Clara served, the rich smell of beef and vegetables filling the warm air. For a moment, no one moved. Then Abigail's clear voice broke the silence. "Lord, we thank you for this food and the hands that prepared it. We ask your blessing on this meal and this company." She paused, then added with quiet intensity, and we pray for truth to stand against all that would hide it. Amen." "Amen," the others echoed softly. They began to eat, passing the bread, the quiet broken only by the clink of spoons and the pop of burning wood in the stove. Gale stared into his bowl, barely tasting the food. Abigail's prayer echoed in his mind. Truth to stand. The truth of what he'd done weighed heavier with each bite. Finally, he set down his spoon. "There's something you all ought to know." The women stilled, watching him. Even young Daniel seemed to sense the moment's gravity. "What happened today, with Rafferty and them papers, it ain't the whole story." Gale's voice was rough. "Truth is, I've been carrying this shame a long while now." He took a deep breath, forcing himself to continue. 3 years back, I lost my wife Sarah and our boy Thomas to fever. Couldn't save them, for all my medical training. After that, well, I took to drinking. Hard. The words came easier now, like poison draining from an old wound. Spent most days in that saloon where Rafferty worked then. He'd buy the drinks, get me talking about my land, my plans. I don't remember signing them papers, don't remember much from those days, but I know I did it. Know I betrayed not just myself, but anyone who might have needed that land. He looked up finally, meeting their eyes one by one. "I ain't asking forgiveness, just wanted you to know the truth of it, the kind of man you're dealing with." Silence filled the cabin. Then Ruth reached across the table and laid her hand on his arm. "We've all known grief, Mr. Thorne. Known what it can do to a person." May nodded. "My husband, he drank too, after the mine accident took his legs. Pain makes us do things we regret." "The past is past," Nanton added softly. "What matters is now." Clara wiped her eyes with her apron. "You saved my Daniel's life. That tells me more about the kind of man you are than any paper signed years ago." Gale's throat tightened. He looked to Abigail, who had remained silent through it all. She met his gaze steadily. "God doesn't waste our pain, Mr. Thorne. Sometimes what breaks us becomes the very thing he uses to heal others." She smiled slightly. "Perhaps that's why he led us to your door, of all the doors in these mountains." The simple faith in her words struck him like a physical blow. Gale pushed back from the table, needing air. He stepped out onto the porch, where fat snowflakes were beginning to fall in the gathering dark. Behind him, the door opened and closed softly. Abigail joined him at the railing, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. "You didn't have to tell us," she said after a moment. "Yes, I did." He watched the snow settle on the yard. Been carrying it alone too long. "And now? Now?" He considered the question. "Now I reckon I owe you all whatever help I can give. Starting with that roof, storm's coming in strong." Abigail's smile was warm in the darkness. "We'd welcome the help." They stood in companionable silence, watching the snow fall. From inside came the sound of dishes being cleared, Clara's soft voice singing a lullaby to Daniel, the other women's quiet conversation. Normal sounds, domestic sounds that Gale's cabin hadn't known in years. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Gale was up before sunrise, gathering tools and materials for the roof repair. He found the women already awake, Ruth and May collecting eggs from the chicken coop, while Clara prepared breakfast. Nanton sat with Daniel, teaching him to whittle a small piece of pine. Abigail emerged from the cabin carrying coffee and biscuits. "Where do we start?" Gale blinked. "We? You didn't think we'd let you do all the work alone?" She handed him a cup. "We may be city folks, but we're not afraid of honest labor." True to her word, within the hour they had organized themselves into an efficient work crew. Gale directed from above, showing them how to replace damaged shingles and seal the worst leaks. Ruth and Clara proved particularly adept at the detailed work, while May's small hands could reach places his couldn't. Nantan kept Daniel occupied and out of harm's way, telling him stories that made the boy laugh. As the morning wore on, Gale found himself watching Abigail. She worked steadily, learning quickly, her face set in concentration. When she caught him looking, she simply smiled and asked what needed doing next. Her quiet strength reminded him painfully of Sarah, yet somehow the comparison didn't hurt as much as it once would have. By midday, they had made significant progress. The worst holes were patched, though more remained to be done. They paused for a simple meal of bread and dried beef, gathering in the yard despite the cold. "Roof's looking better?" Abigail observed, brushing sawdust from her skirt. Gale nodded. "Should hold against the storm at least, though there's plenty more needs fixing." "Then we'll fix it," she said simply. "Together." The word hung in the crisp air. Together. Gale couldn't remember the last time he'd been part of any together. Yet here he was, surrounded by these women who had every reason to despise him, but had chosen forgiveness instead. The afternoon found them back at work, racing the gathering clouds. As Gale handed down another bundle of shingles, he realized something had shifted inside him. The weight of his past sins hadn't disappeared, but it felt lighter somehow, shared among these unexpected companions who had brought grace to his door. By sunset, when the first fresh snowflakes began to fall, the roof was as secure as they could make it. They gathered their tools and headed inside, where Clara had a pot of beans simmering on the stove. The cabin felt different now, not just warmer and drier, but fuller somehow. More alive. As they settled around the table, Abigail caught his eye and smiled. In that smile, Gale saw something he thought he'd lost forever, the possibility of redemption, not earned but freely given. He bowed his head as she began the blessing, and for the first time in years, his quiet "Amen" carried the weight of genuine prayer. The January sun cast long shadows through frosted windows as Abigail sat with the child at Gale's weathered table. Her finger traced beneath the words in the old Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. "Can you read this verse for me, Jonah?" The boy squinted at the page, his tongue peeking out in concentration. "And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes." "Very good," Abigail squeezed his shoulder. "You're learning so quickly." From her place by the hearth, Ruth looked up from her mending and smiled. "He has a good teacher." The cabin had transformed in the days since their arrival. Gone were the cobwebs and layers of dust that had marked Gale's solitary existence. The wooden floors gleamed from repeated scrubbing, and fresh pine boughs in tin cans brought life to empty corners. Even the air felt different. Warmer, softer, with the scent of fresh bread and brewing coffee. Ruth began to hum as she worked, her voice lifting in a Cherokee hymn her grandmother had taught her. The melody filled the cabin, ancient and sweet. Little Jonah abandoned his reading to listen, dark eyes wide with wonder. "What's she singing about?" he whispered to Abigail. "It's a song of thanksgiving," Ruth explained, pausing in her work. "For shelter in storm, for friends in need." She smiled at the boy. "For new family found in unexpected places." The door creaked open, bringing a blast of cold air and Gale's broad figure. He stamped snow from his boots, hanging his heavy coat by the door. His arms cradled a bundle of mended traps. "Storm's coming," he announced, moving to warm his hands by the fire. Saw the clouds building up over Thunder Peak. Abigail noticed how he moved more easily now, less like a bear disturbed from hibernation. The rigid set of his shoulders had softened, and sometimes, not often, but sometimes, they caught glimpses of a smile beneath his beard. "Tell us about your Sarah's roses again," Clara called from where she was kneading dough. "The yellow ones that climbed the porch." Goyle settled into his chair by the fire, running rough hands over the trap wire. Lady Banks' roses, they were called. Sarah ordered them special from a nursery back east, said they reminded her of sunshine. His voice grew soft with memory. She'd spend hours tending those vines, singing while she worked. Come June, the whole porch would be draped in gold. "What happened to them?" Jonah asked, abandoning his Bible lesson entirely now. "Died the winter she did." Gale's hands stilled on the trap. "Couldn't bear to plant more after." Abigail watched pain flicker across his face, but it was different now, an old ache rather than a fresh wound. "Perhaps come spring," she ventured carefully, "we might try roses again. I know something of gardening." Gale looked up, meeting her eyes. Something passed between them, quiet as a heartbeat. "Perhaps," he said softly. The moment broke as May burst through the door, her arms full of gathered kindling. "Clara, the flour, we're almost out." Clara dusted her hands on her apron, frowning. "The salt pork's low too, and we used the last candle last night." "The mission store," Ruth suggested, setting aside her mending. 10 miles south, near the old creek crossing. Been abandoned since summer, but might still have supplies." Goyle nodded slowly. "Could be. Missionary family left in a hurry when the fever came through. Might have left something useful behind." "We should go tomorrow," Abigail decided, "before this storm hits. May and I can—" "I'll go," Gale cut in. "Too dangerous for women alone." "We've managed dangerous before," Abigail reminded him gently, "and more hands mean more we can carry back." He studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "First light then. You, me, and May. The rest stay here with the boy." That evening, as snow began to fall, they gathered close around the fire. Ruth's voice rose again in song, and this time Clara joined in, teaching them all a hymn she'd learned as a girl. Even Gale hummed along, soft and uncertain at first, then with growing confidence. Abigail watched the firelight play across their faces. Ruth's serene strength, Clara's gentle determination, May's quick smile, little Jonah's trust, and Gale's gradual awakening. They were an unlikely family, thrown together by tragedy and chance. Yet something was growing here, as sturdy as Sarah's roses had once been. The child fell asleep in Ruth's lap, her dark hands stroking his hair as she sang. Clara and May played cards by candlelight, their quiet laughter mixing with the crackle of the fire. Gale worked at his traps, the rhythmic sound of wire being twisted a counterpoint to the women's voices. Abigail picked up her Bible again, but found herself watching them instead of reading. 6 weeks ago they had been strangers. Now they moved around each other with the ease of long familiarity, passing coffee without being asked, anticipating needs, sharing spaces and stories and songs. "Penny for your thoughts." Goyle's low voice startled her. He had moved to sit beside her, his presence solid and warm. "I was thinking about home," she said honestly. "How it's not always where or what we expect it to be." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Never thought to share this place again. After Sarah?" He trailed off, then continued softly. "Cabin feels different now. More like it used to." "Is that all right?" Abigail asked carefully. Gale was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames. "Reckon it is," he said finally. "Reckon Sarah would have liked this. House full of life again. She never did approve of too much solitude." Their conversation was interrupted by May's sudden exclamation. "Last candle's about done." Indeed, the stub of tallow was guttering in its holder, throwing wild shadows on the walls. Clara gathered up the cards while Ruth carried the sleeping child to his pallet near the fire. "Early start tomorrow," Abigail reminded them, rising to bank the fire for the night. "Best get some rest." As they settled into their various sleeping places, the women sharing quilts near the hearth, Gale on his cot by the door, the child curled in his nest of blankets, the cabin grew quiet. Snow whispered against the windows, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its mate. Abigail lay awake for a time, listening to the peaceful sounds of breathing around her. So much had changed since that desperate night when they'd stumbled through the snow to Gale's door. They'd arrived as refugees, half-frozen and grief-stricken. Now they were something else, something new and fragile and precious, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through snow. Not quite a family, perhaps, but no longer strangers either. The last candle flickered and died, leaving only the glow of banked coals. In the darkness, Abigail heard Gale shift on his cot, then his deep voice reciting softly, almost to himself, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." She smiled, remembering the verse from that afternoon's lesson with Jonah. Joy was coming. Yes, not in great bursts, but in small, steady moments. In shared meals and songs, in lessons and stories, in the gradual healing of wounded hearts. Tomorrow they would face new challenges, braving the winter trails to find supplies. But tonight, in this cabin that had somehow become home, they rested in the peace of belonging. The fire settled with a soft hiss of sparks. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence. Inside, 7 souls slept, their dreams mingling in the darkness like threads being woven into a new tapestry of hope. The morning dawned bitter cold, frost etching delicate patterns across the cabin's windows. Gale stood by the door, adjusting the straps on his snow boots, while Clara wrapped extra blankets around her substantial frame. "You sure about this?" he asked, eyeing her bulky figure. "Could take May instead." Clara snorted, securing her woolen scarf. "That slip of a girl? No offense to her capabilities, but you'll need someone who can haul their weight." "Besides," she added with a knowing look, "I've handled worse than a few miles through snow." Gale nodded, knowing better than to argue. They'd spent the early hours preparing the sled, lashing empty crates and barrels for whatever supplies they might find. The other women gathered to see them off, worry evident in their faces. "Be careful," Abigail said, pressing a small package of cornbread into Clara's hands. "The weather feels unsettled." Ruth hugged Clara tight, whispering something in Cherokee that made the older woman smile. May helped adjust the sled runners one last time, while little Jonah watched with wide eyes from the doorway. The morning air bit sharp as broken glass when they set out. Gale took point, breaking trail through knee-deep snow, while Clara managed the sled's guide ropes, their breath frosted in white clouds, and the runners' soft shush-shush marked their passage through the silent forest. "Tell me about this mission," Clara said after they'd covered the first mile. Her voice carried clearly in the winter stillness. "What happened to the folk there?" Gale ducked under a snow-laden branch before answering. "Reverend Matthews and his wife ran it for near on 15 years. Good people. Built the store to trade fair with settlers and natives both." He paused, remembering. "When the fever came through last summer, they stayed too long trying to help. Buried half their congregation before the territory doctor ordered them to leave." Clara clucked her tongue sympathetically. "Lord's mercy. Any chance they left medicine behind?" "Hope so. They left in a hurry, from what I heard. The sun climbed higher as they traveled, but brought little warmth. Around midday, they stopped to rest in a small clearing. Clara produced the cornbread, sharing it between them as they caught their breath. "Something's changing in him," she remarked, brushing crumbs from her coat. "Our Mr. Thorne." Gale looked up sharply, but Clara's expression held only thoughtful consideration. "Man can't help but change," she continued, "with 5 women and a child filling his quiet spaces with life again. Might do him good to remember he's not meant to walk alone in this world." Gale said nothing, but his shoulders tensed. Clara watched him a moment longer, then changed the subject to more practical matters. The afternoon brought harder going. The trail narrowed through a rocky pass, forcing them to manhandle the sled over rough patches. Storm clouds gathered overhead, turning the forest twilight dim hours before true dusk. "There," Gale pointed finally, as they crested a rise. Below them stood a collection of log buildings, their windows dark and snow drifted against their walls. The mission store was the largest structure, its cross-topped roof stark against the gathering gloom. They approached cautiously, though Gale knew the place was abandoned. The store's door creaked open at his push, stirring dust and memories. Clara fumbled with her tinderbox, soon lighting a lamp they'd brought. The lamplight revealed empty shelves and scattered debris. Paper, broken crates, a toppled chair. But not everything had been taken. Clara's excited whisper drew Gale's attention to a back corner. "Look here! Salt pork, dried beans, 2 sacks of flour still good in their barrels." She moved deeper into the shadows. "Candles too, praise be, and some medical supplies." Gale nodded in satisfaction, but his attention had been caught by something else. A leather-bound book lay open on the store's counter, its pages yellow in the lamplight. Moving closer, he recognized it as the mission's ledger. As Clara bustled about gathering supplies, Gale leafed through the ledger's recent entries. His breath caught at a notation dated just 2 months prior. "Widow's Colony, property pending railroad purchase." The entry was initialed CR, Clive Rafferty. His hands shook slightly as he tore the page free, folding it carefully before tucking it inside his coat. The evidence of Rafferty's scheme, written in black and white, made his blood run cold. "Gale," Clara called from the back room. "Found some blankets. Bit dusty, but sound." He closed the ledger, pushing aside his dark thoughts to help load their findings. They worked quickly, aware of the deepening darkness outside. Soon the sled was packed full, their lamp the only light for miles around. The return journey proved more challenging. Snow had begun to fall, thick flakes that further obscured the already dim trail. Gale took the lead rope now, while Clara held the lamp high to light their way. They had covered perhaps 3 miles when Gale heard it, a long, low howl that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. Clara's lamp wavered slightly. "Wolves," she whispered unnecessarily. "How far?" "Too close." Gale kept his voice steady, though his hand moved to the rifle slung across his back. "Keep moving. Steady pace." Another howl sounded, closer this time, answered by others. The pack was moving parallel to their trail, using the trees for cover. Gale could almost feel their hungry eyes watching, waiting for a mistake. Clara began humming under her breath, an old hymn that seemed to steady her nerves. The sled runners whispered, through the snow, marking time to her quiet song. Gale held the lead rope in one hand, rifle ready in the other. The attack, when it came, was swift and silent. A dark shape burst from the trees to their left, while others circled behind. Gale's rifle cracked once, twice, 3 times, warning shots that sent snow spraying from tree trunks near the wolves. The pack melted back into the shadows, but Gale knew they hadn't given up. "Keep close," he told Clara. "They'll try again if they think we're weak." "Weak?" Clara's voice held a hint of steel beneath its tremor. "I survived my Jim's cooking for 30 years. These mangy curs don't frighten me." Despite the tension, Gale felt his mouth twitch. They pressed on through the deepening night, Clara's lamp a fragile circle of light in the vast darkness. The wolves paced them, occasionally visible as swift shadows between the trees. Twice more they had to fire warning shots. But the pack seemed warier now, perhaps deciding the prey wasn't worth the risk. As the cabin's familiar shape finally emerged from the snowy night, Gale heard the wolves' farewell howls fading into the distance. Light spilled from the cabin's windows, and figures hurried out at the sound of their approach. Abigail held a lantern high, while May and Ruth helped guide the sled to a stop. Little Jonah bounced excitedly despite the late hour, pulling at Clara's skirts as she climbed stiffly down. "We were so worried," Abigail said, helping to unhitch the sled. "When the storm started building." "Takes more than a bit of weather to stop Clara Whitcomb," Clara declared, though she leaned heavily on Ruth's arm. "And we found good supplies, too. Salt pork, flour, even some proper medicine." As the others crowded around to help unload, Gale stood apart, one hand pressed against the damning ledger page in his coat. The railroad's plan to seize the widow's colony land was proceeding, official and deliberate. The knowledge sat like a stone in his gut. "Gale?" Abigail's voice drew him back to the present. She stood in the cabin's doorway, lamplight haloing her hair. "Come in where it's warm. Clara's making coffee and there's stew still hot on the stove." He nodded, following her inside. The cabin's warmth wrapped around him like a physical thing, along with the smell of food and the sound of voices. Clara was already holding court by the fire, describing their wolf encounter with dramatic flourishes that had Jonah wide-eyed with excitement. "And then," she was saying, "your Mr. Thorne there stood like Daniel himself, facing down those beasts with nothing but faith and gunpowder." "Weren't quite like that," Gale muttered, accepting a cup of coffee from May. "Hush now," Clara said firmly. "Let an old woman tell it her way." The ledger page seemed to burn against his chest, but Gale said nothing. Tomorrow would be soon enough to share its contents. Tonight, watching Clara gesture expansively while the others laughed, he allowed himself to simply be grateful for their safe return. Outside, snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness, wolves sang their ancient songs. But inside the cabin, lamplight gleamed on familiar faces, and the coffee was hot. And for now, that was enough. The morning sun streamed through the cabin's windows, catching dust motes that danced in the golden light. Mei Li stood at the rough-hewn table, her small hands covered in flour as she kneaded bread dough with practiced movements. The familiar task brought comfort, reminding her of mornings in her mother's kitchen long ago. Near her elbow lay the preacher's old Bible, rescued from their wagon after the attack. Its leather cover was worn smooth with age, its pages dog-eared from years of use. May had placed it there hoping to read a psalm while the bread rose, as was her custom. As she worked the dough, her sleeve caught the Bible's edge, knocking it to the floor. It fell open, and something fluttered out. A yellowed envelope she hadn't noticed before, tucked deep within its pages. May wiped her hands on her apron and carefully retrieved it. "Abigail?" she called softly, not wanting to wake the others who still slept. "Could you come look at this?" Abigail appeared from the back room where she'd been sorting through their meager supplies. Her face showed curiosity as she approached. "What have you found, May?" "It fell from the Bible." May handed over the envelope, watching as Abigail examined it with careful fingers. The schoolteacher's eyes widened as she pulled out several sheets of paper, official-looking documents with elaborate letterhead and red wax seals. This is the colony charter, she breathed. The original one, with the Denver clerk's stamp right here. May moved closer, peering at the formal script. Is it important? Important? Abigail's voice trembled with excitement. This could change everything. This proves the land was legally designated for the widow's colony before Rafferty ever filed his false claims. She touched the official stamp reverently. With this, we could void his entire scheme. The sound of heavy boots announced Gale's return from his morning trap check. He stomped snow from his feet at the threshold, then paused at the sight of their intense expressions. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Abigail said, holding up the charter. Everything might finally be right. She explained their discovery as Gale came to examine the documents. His weathered face grew thoughtful as he read. This is proper legal proof, all right, but it'll need to be notarized in Redemption Gulch to stand against Rafferty's claims in court. Then we'll go to Redemption Gulch, Abigail said firmly. First thing tomorrow. May returned to her bread making, but her movements were lighter now, hopeful. As she worked, she listened to Abigail and Gale planning their journey, their voices low but intense. It's not safe, Gale was saying. Rafferty's got friends in that town, and enemies of mine might still be around from before. We can't let fear stop us, Abigail countered. This is God's providence, plain as day. That charter being hidden in the Bible all this time, that's no coincidence. The cabin gradually came alive as the others woke. Clara stoked the fire while Ruth helped Jonah dress for the day. The boys' excited chatter filled the room as May shaped her dough into loaves and set them near the hearth to rise. When Abigail shared their discovery, the news sparked a flurry of activity. The women gathered around the table, examining the charter while discussing what needed to be done. Even little Jonah sensed the importance of the moment, standing on tiptoe to peek at the mysterious papers. Look here, Clara pointed to a line of text. It's got the governor's seal and everything. Rafferty can't argue with that. He'll try, Gale said grimly. Man like that, he'll have some trick ready. Then we'll be ready too, Abigail replied. She spread the charter carefully on the table, smoothing its creased corners. May, would you help me copy down the key points? We should have a backup of the important details, just in case. May nodded, glad to be useful. Her neat handwriting, learned during her father's insistence on proper business records, would serve them well. She retrieved paper and pencil from Abigail's teaching supplies and began transcribing while the others continued their planning. Throughout the day, the charter remained the center of attention. Ruth suggested hiding it in different places on their persons during the journey, while Clara offered to create a false document to carry as a decoy. May listened to their ideas while continuing her household tasks, noting how Gale grew increasingly quiet and watchful. As evening approached, the cabin filled with savory smells from May's fresh bread and the stew bubbling on the stove. The women gathered for their usual supper, but tonight's meal had an undercurrent of nervous energy. Tomorrow's journey weighed heavy on their minds. After the dishes were cleared and Jonah was tucked into his bed, May observed Gale and Abigail standing near the cabin's single window. The lamplight cast their shadows long against the wall as they spoke in hushed tones. I don't like you risking yourself, Gale was saying. Let me take the charter alone. I can handle whatever comes. Abigail shook her head. We need a witness to the notarization, someone who knows the full truth of our claim. That has to be me. She touched his arm gently. We do this together. May pretended to be absorbed in her mending, but she couldn't help watching as Goyle struggled with Abigail's words. The big man's face showed the same conflict she'd seen when he first opened his door to them, the battle between his instinct to protect and his fear of involvement. Finally, Gale's shoulders straightened with resolve. "I'll see it right," he promised Abigail, his voice low but firm. "No matter what it costs." The words seemed to fill the cabin, settling like a warm blanket over their preparations for sleep. May carefully stored the precious charter in a clean cloth, saying a silent prayer in her mother's language for its safety. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight they had hope. Hope hidden between the pages of an old Bible, waiting to be revealed at just the right time. As she banked the fire for the night, May caught sight of Gale checking his rifle one last time before settling into his bedroll near the door. Abigail sat at the table, reading the charter by lamplight, her lips moving in silent prayer. The scene struck May as a perfect picture of their situation. Strength and faith working together, with Providence watching over all. The cabin gradually grew quiet, filled only with the soft sounds of sleeping breath and the occasional pop from the dying fire. Outside, a coyote called lonely in the distance, but inside these walls, none of them were alone anymore. They had found something more precious than land or legal rights. They had found family. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but tonight they rested in the knowledge that truth was on their side, hidden all this time in the most obvious place, the very word that had guided their steps to this moment. May smiled as she drifted off to sleep, remembering her mother's words about faith being like bread dough. It only needed patience and the right conditions to rise. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around the cabin like a heavy blanket, broken only by the dying embers in the hearth. Inside, the widows slept soundly, their breathing a gentle chorus in the quiet hours before sunrise. Gale sat in his customary spot by the door, rifle across his knees, keeping his habitual watch despite the peace of recent weeks. A sharp crack of a branch outside made his head snap up. Years of frontier living had taught him to distinguish between sounds, the step of a deer versus a bear, the rustle of wind versus an intruder. This sound was different, deliberate, human. Then he heard it, the unmistakable rhythm of approaching hoofbeats, multiple horses moving at a controlled pace. His heart quickened as he rose silently to his feet. "Abigail," he whispered, crossing to where she slept near the hearth. "Wake up! Riders coming!" She woke instantly, years of widowhood having taught her vigilance. "How many?" "Can't tell yet. Military by the sound of it." Gale moved to the window, careful to stay hidden as he peered out. The pale light of approaching dawn revealed a group of mounted figures emerging from the tree line. Their straight-backed posture and uniform movement confirmed his suspicion. United States Cavalry. The word cavalry carried through the quiet cabin like a thunderclap. Nantan and Ruth, who had stirred at the first whispered warnings, went rigid with terror. Their faces, normally so composed, showed naked fear in the dim light. "The loft," Gale said quickly, gesturing to the ladder. "Now." The two native women needed no further urging. They moved with practiced silence, gathering their skirts and climbing swiftly into the shadowy space above. May and Clara were awake now, too, huddled protectively around young Jonah. The hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of military tack and the creak of leather saddles. Gale's mind raced. The cabin had only one door, 2 windows. The chimney smoke would already have revealed their presence. "Abigail," he said low, "you do the talking. They're less likely to push past a white woman." He positioned himself just beside the door, where he could hear but remain unseen. "Keep your voice steady, no matter what." She nodded, smoothing her hair and skirts with trembling hands. The transformation in her bearing was remarkable. from frightened widow to composed schoolteacher, in the space of a breath. A sharp rap at the door made them all jump. "Coming!" Abigail called out, her voice admirably calm. She opened the door just wide enough to be polite, letting in a shaft of gray morning light. "May I help you, gentlemen?" "Ma'am?" A sergeant's gruff voice carried clearly into the cabin. "We're tracking 2 escaped reservation women. Seen any Indians pass through here?" "Indians?" Abigail's surprise sounded genuine, even to Gale's knowing ears. "No, sir. We've seen no one but the occasional trapper these past weeks." "We?" The sergeant's tone sharpened with interest. "Yes. Myself and several other widows. We're homesteading here temporarily while our permanent settlement is prepared." From his position, Gale could see the sergeant lean forward in his saddle, trying to peer past Abigail into the cabin's interior. The man's weather-beaten face showed equal parts suspicion and frustration. "Mind if we take a look inside, ma'am? Just to be thorough." Abigail's spine stiffened. "I do mind, Sergeant. We are decent Christian women, not fully dressed for receiving male visitors at this hour. Surely you understand." The sergeant's mount stamped restlessly in the snow. Behind him, 4 other cavalrymen sat their horses with military precision, their breath frosting in the cold air. "Ma'am, we have orders. These women are ward of the government, escaped from the reservation where they're legally bound to stay. Harboring them would be a federal offense." "I am well aware of the law, Sergeant." Abigail's voice took on the stern tone Gale had heard her use with Jonah during lessons. "And I am equally aware of my rights as a citizen. Unless you have a warrant, you have no authority to enter this private dwelling." A tense silence followed. Gale's finger rested lightly on his rifle's trigger guard, though he prayed it wouldn't come to that. Taking arms against U.S. soldiers would mean death or prison, no matter how just the cause. Finally, the sergeant straightened in his saddle. "Very well, ma'am. But we'll be back tomorrow with proper papers. Those women are dangerous, killed their husbands and fled with stolen goods, according to the Indian agent's report." Gale's jaw clenched at the lie. He had heard both Nantan's and Ruth's stories of their husbands' deaths, one in a mining accident, the other from fever. The Indian agent's false accusation was clearly meant to justify their pursuit and prevent any sympathetic settlers from offering aid. "That's very concerning," Abigail replied smoothly. "We'll certainly be on our guard. Good day, Sergeant." The door closed with a decisive click. They all held their breath as the hoofbeats gradually receded into the distance. Only when the sound had completely faded did Abigail's composed facade crack. She sagged against the wall, trembling. Guile moved swiftly to the loft ladder. "It's clear now," he called softly. "You can come down." Nantan and Ruth descended carefully. Both women's faces showed the strain of the past few minutes, but also a weariness that spoke of long familiarity with such threats. "They will return," Nantan said quietly. "With papers, with more men. They always do." "We should leave," Ruth added, her usual pragmatic nature asserting itself. "We cannot bring such trouble to your home, Gale." "No." The word came out fiercer than he intended, surprising even himself. Gale moved to stand before them, his massive frame blocking the door as if the cavalry might burst through it at any moment. "This is your home too now, all of you." He looked around at their faces, Nantan and Ruth with their careful dignity, May and Clara still protective of young Jonah, Abigail watching him with something like wonder. These women who had arrived as strangers were now as much his family as his long-lost wife and son had been. His grip tightened on his rifle as he spoke words that would forever mark his transformation from lonely trapper to defender of this makeshift clan. No one takes family from my house." The simple declaration seemed to fill the cabin with new strength. Abigail stepped forward to take his free hand, her own trembling subsiding at his touch. "Then we need a plan," she said firmly. "They'll be back tomorrow, and we must be ready." Ruth nodded slowly. "The storm cellar," she suggested. "If we clear it today, make it comfortable." "And the old mine shaft," May added. "The one Gale showed me when I was gathering kindling. It's well hidden." "We'll prepare both," Gale agreed. "And more besides. But first, everyone eat. We've got a long day ahead." As the women moved to their morning tasks with renewed purpose, Gile remained by the window, watching the trail where the cavalry had disappeared. The decision he'd just made could cost him everything: his freedom, possibly his life. Yet he felt more at peace than he had in years. He glanced at the Bible on Abigail's small table, remembering words his mother used to quote about being your brother's keeper. Perhaps God had sent these women to his door for just this purpose, not only to heal his lonely heart, but to give him a chance to stand for what was right. Outside, the sun finally crested the eastern mountains, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of rose and gold. A new day was beginning, bringing with it the promise of confrontation. But they would face it together, this unlikely family forged in adversity and bound by something stronger than blood. The choice to stand for one another, come what may. Throughout the day, they worked to prepare. The storm cellar was cleared and lined with quilts. Provisions were divided and hidden in various caches. Gile checked and cleaned every weapon in the cabin, while Abigail wrote out a careful account of events thus far, including the false accusations against Nantan and Ruth. "In case things go badly," she explained as she sealed the letter, "the truth should be known." Nantan worked silently, preparing medicine bundles with herbs and prayers. Ruth taught Clara and May some basic Navajo words: how to ask for help, give warnings, signal danger. Even little Jonah seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, practicing moving quietly and speaking in whispers. As evening approached, Gale stood in the doorway, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The weight of his rifle was familiar in his hands, but it felt different now. No longer just a tool for hunting or self-defense, it had become a symbol of his commitment to protect this newfound family, whatever the cost. Behind him, he could hear the soft murmur of women's voices as they prepared the evening meal. Jonah's quiet laughter at something May had said, the homey sounds of plates being set on the table. Sounds he had thought never to hear again after losing his wife and son. Sounds that made this cabin a home worth defending. He turned back inside, closing the door against the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight, they would break bread together and draw strength from their unity. Tonight, they were simply family, gathered safe and warm, while outside the winter wind sang its ancient songs through the pines. Dawn painted the mountains in streaks of pale gold as Gale and Abigail prepared their horses. The charter, carefully wrapped in oilskin, rested secure in Abigail's saddlebag. Frost crackled under their boots while they worked, their breath forming clouds in the bitter morning air. "The others will manage fine," Abigail said softly, noting Gale's backward glance at the cabin. "Ruth knows herbs as well as any doctor, and Clara's aim is true if trouble comes." Gale nodded, adjusting Bearclaw's cinch. "Still don't like leaving them, with those soldiers due back." His big hands moved surely over the leather straps, checking each buckle twice. "We've no choice. This charter must be notarized before Rafferty can file his claim." Abigail mounted her borrowed mare with practiced ease, her dark skirts arranged neatly despite the wind's interference. They set out as the sun cleared, the eastern ridge, following the winding trail down toward Redemption Gulch. The morning started clear enough, but by midday, heavy clouds rolled in from the west, bringing with them a bitter wind that cut through clothing like knives. "Storm's coming fast," Gale called out, his voice nearly lost in the rising gale. "There's a ravine ahead where we can shelter. Might have to wait it out." Abigail merely nodded, her face already red and chapped from the wind. They pressed on until they found the ravine, a deep cut in the earth that offered some protection from the worst of the weather. Guile helped Abigail dismount, his hands lingering just a moment longer than necessary to ensure she was steady. They worked together without words, making camp with the efficiency of those used to frontier life. Gale gathered wood, while Abigail created a windbreak using their saddle blankets. Soon, a small fire cast dancing shadows on the ravine walls, and they huddled close to its warmth, sharing coffee from Goyle's battered tin pot. As evening deepened, so did the storm's fury. Snow fell in thick curtains past the ravine's edge, but their little camp remained relatively protected. The horses stood close together, sharing warmth, while Gale and Abigail sat shoulder to shoulder near the fire. "My Thomas would have approved of what you're doing," Abigail said suddenly, her voice soft but clear above the wind's howl. "He believed in standing up for what's right, no matter the cost." Gale turned slightly, studying her face in the firelight. "Tell me about him." Abigail's fingers twisted in her shawl. "He was a railroad surveyor, good at his work, respected by all. But when he saw how the Apache workers were being treated, underpaid, denied medical care, accused of theft to withhold wages, he couldn't stay silent." She drew a deep breath. "He started keeping records, gathering proof. Then one morning they found him behind the paymaster's office. They said it was a robbery gone wrong, but—" "You knew different," Gale finished quietly. She nodded. "He died defending people who couldn't defend themselves. I've tried to live by his example ever since." Gale stared into the fire, thinking of his own years of hiding from the world's injustices. "You're braver than most, Abigail Holt. Braver than me, that's certain." "No," she said firmly. "You opened your door to strangers. You're risking everything to help us now. That takes its own kind of courage." Their eyes met across the flames, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who had both known loss, but chosen to keep their hearts open despite it. The night passed slowly, with both taking turns to tend the fire and watch. By morning, the storm had blown itself out, leaving the world transformed under a blanket of fresh snow. They broke camp early, eager to reach town before Rafferty could cause more mischief. The final miles into Redemption Gulch were hard going. The new snow concealed treacherous ground, forcing them to ride slowly and carefully. By the time they caught sight of the town's first buildings, their faces were raw from the wind, and their muscles ached from hours in the saddle. Gale glanced at Abigail, noting how she sat straight despite her obvious exhaustion. The trust she'd shown in sharing her husband's story, the quiet strength she displayed in every challenge, it stirred something in his heart he'd thought long dead. She caught his look and smiled slightly, her eyes warm with understanding. They rode into town side by side, the charter secure between them, ready to face whatever waited ahead. The town notary's office smelled of dust and old paper. Behind a scratched desk, the elderly clerk adjusted his spectacles, carefully examining the charter Abigail and Gale presented. His gnarled fingers traced each line of text, comparing stamps and dates. "This document appears genuine," he announced finally, reaching for his official seal. "Properly filed in Denver last spring." The heavy brass stamp came down with a satisfying thunk, leaving its mark in red ink. "There you have it, legally binding and notarized." Abigail's hands trembled as she took the charter, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, then turned to Gale. "Thank you for everything." Before he could respond, she rose on tiptoe and pressed a soft kiss to his weathered cheek. The gesture was quick and modest, but it sent warmth spreading through his chest. In that moment, all his years of solitude seemed to melt away. They left Redemption Gulch as the sun began to set, their spirits soaring despite their tired bodies. The charter represented more than land now. It was a promise of new beginnings, of family restored, of hope reborn. The horses picked their way carefully up the snow-covered pass in the gathering dusk. As they crested the final ridge overlooking their valley, Gale suddenly pulled Bearclaw to a halt. Against the darkening sky, thick orange smoke rose from where their cabin should be. "No," he breathed, his voice hoarse with horror. Without a word, he dug his heels into Bearclaw's flanks, urging the horse forward. Behind him he heard Abigail's desperate gasp as she too spurred her mount. Together they raced down the trail, dread growing with every stride as the flames painted the valley in terrible light. They reached the cabin as the last flames sputtered in the snow. Where their home had stood, only blackened beams remained, still smoking against the twilight sky. The warmth and life they'd built together lay in ashes before them. Gale dismounted first, his boots crunching on charred wood. "Clara! Ruth!" His deep voice cracked as he called out. Only the wind answered. Abigail wrapped her shawl tighter, scanning the ground. "Here, footprints." She pointed to multiple tracks leading down towards the valley, some small and hurried, others heavy and purposeful. Moving through the ruins, Gale's foot struck something that glinted. He bent down and lifted Nantan's silver cross necklace from the soot, its chain broken. Beside it lay a crumpled paper, its edges singed. He smoothed it open, jaw tightening as he read the words. "Railroad property. Remove occupants." Raw fury coursed through him. Without a word, he strode to Bearclaw and pulled his rifle from its scabbard. His hands shook as he checked the ammunition. "Gale, wait!" Abigail caught his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "Don't meet fire with fire. That's not the way." He turned to her, anguish etched across his face. "They burned our home, drove out our family. And we'll get them back," she said softly. "But not with more violence. Remember what brought us together. Mercy, not vengeance." The rifle lowered slowly in his grip as her words sank in. The rage in his chest gave way to something deeper. Faith in the path of peace she offered. He nodded once, returning the weapon to its scabbard. "You're right," he said quietly. "There's a better way." The first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds as Gale and Abigail rode into Redemption Gulch. Their horses' hooves echoed on the frozen ground, drawing faces to windows and doorways. Behind them, smoke still rose from their burned cabin, a dark finger against the pale dawn sky. "Look there," Abigail whispered, nodding toward Hawkins's general store. A cluster of townspeople huddled close, their voices hushed but urgent. As Gale and Abigail passed, fragments of conversation drifted to them. "Rafferty's gone too far this time. Burning out widows in winter. Ain't Christian, ain't right." Gale dismounted before the marshal's office, his movements deliberate. He left his rifle with his horse, a gesture that drew watching eyes. Marshal Dunbar stood on his porch, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. "Need to talk, Marshal," Gale said, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. "About justice under the law." Before Dunbar could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the railroad camp. Through the crowd came the widows, Ruth leading with her head high, Nanton supporting Clara, May carrying the child. Their dresses were sooted, their faces streaked with dirt, but their eyes blazed with determination. "We escaped in the night," Ruth announced, her voice strong and clear, "when they were drunk with their victory." The townsfolk gathered closer, forming a circle around the scene. Someone whispered, "Lord, have mercy." Another voice added, "Them's women of courage, sure enough." Abigail rushed to embrace them, tears flowing freely. Gael stood rooted, his throat tight with emotion as he watched their family reunite. The silence in the street grew heavy with meaning as more townspeople emerged, drawn by the widow's quiet dignity and unbroken spirit. The wind carried flakes of snow as Abigail stepped forward, unfolding the precious charter with trembling hands. Her voice rang clear and strong across the hushed street. "By decree of the territory of Colorado," she read, "these lands are hereby granted to establish the Widows' Colony, a sanctuary for those left alone by war and hardship, to build anew in Christian fellowship." Women emerged from the gathering crowd. Martha Wheeler, the baker's widow, spoke first. "Rafferty tried to buy my shop for pennies last spring." Others joined in, their voices rising with long-hidden grievances against the railroad man's schemes. Marshal Dunbar examined the charter, comparing it to Rafferty's document. His weathered face hardened. "This deed," he declared, holding up Rafferty's paper, "is confirmed fraudulent. The land belongs to the Widows' Colony, as rightful and legal as any claim in Colorado territory." Rafferty, standing near the saloon, went pale. "You can't," he started, but jeers from the crowd drowned his protests. He backed away, turned, and ran towards the stables, leaving his dignity behind in the snow. Gail's legs gave way. He sank to his knees in the frozen street, years of guilt washing away in hot tears. Abigail moved quietly to his side, her hand warm on his shoulder. Her touch held forgiveness, acceptance, and something more. A promise of tomorrow. The mission bells began to toll, their bronze voices singing across the valley. Each clear note seemed to proclaim the triumph of justice, of mercy over greed, of love over fear. The widows stood together, their faces glowing with vindication and hope, as the morning sun broke through the clouds and set the snow-covered streets aglitter with light. Warm April sunlight bathed the valley, turning winter's scars into promises of renewal. Where ash and snow had covered the ground, fresh-cut timber now stood as cabin frames, their raw wood perfuming the air. Women moved between the buildings like busy bees, hanging quilts, planting gardens, and carrying water from the creek. Near his cabin's new porch, Gael knelt in the soft earth, carefully settling a small rose cutting into the soil. His rough hands, more used to rifle and trap than tender growth, moved with gentle precision. This sprout, saved from his wife's garden years ago, would bloom again in new soil. Laughter rang across the settlement as little Jonah chased a butterfly between the garden rows. His nightmares had faded with winter, replaced by the simple joys of childhood restored. Abigail watched him from the cook fire, her face glowing as she stirred a pot of rabbit stew. "Supper's ready," she called, and workers set down their tools, gathering with grateful smiles. As evening painted the sky in soft purple, hymns drifted from the newly raised chapel. The sound wrapped around them like a mother's embrace. Gael stood on his porch, watching lanterns wink to life across the valley. Each flame marked a home, a family rebuilt from sorrow. He felt Abigail's hand slip into his, warm and sure. "Reckon the Lord was listenin' all along," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. She squeezed his fingers. As they gazed out over their growing community, this living proof that grace could rebuild even what fire had claimed. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.